We had to prioritize. My stepmom smiled. I got the last table at my dad's wedding. At my dad's wedding, I found my name at the last table with the distant cousins, not family. Well, we had to prioritize, my stepmom smiled. My stepbrother sat next to my dad at the front. So I said, "Thanks for making it so easy," and walked out. I'd known for a long time that my dad wasn't proud of me. It wasn't something he ever said outright, he's too polite for that. But it was there in the way he talked about me, or more often, the way he didn't. When people asked about my stepbrother Kyle, my dad would light up. He'd talk about how hard Kyle worked, how well he was doing in real estate. There was always some new deal, some new property investment, something to be impressed by. When people asked about me, there was hesitation, a polite nod, a vague "she's doing her thing." He didn't say much else because in his eyes, there wasn't much else worth saying. I didn't turn out the way he wanted. I didn't chase money or power. I chose a job he thought was beneath me, nursing. I lived a life that seemed small to him. Because of that, I'd been an afterthought for years. The wedding was just confirmation of what I already knew. I wasn't expecting a big role or to be the center of attention. But I also wasn't expecting to be tucked away at the back like I barely mattered. I stood at the seating chart scanning the names. Dad and Rebecca at the front table, obviously. Kyle, his wife Jennifer, his business partner, and his closest friends at the head table, all placed next to my dad like they were the core of the family. My name? Table 14. Buried among distant cousins I hadn't seen since childhood, people who probably wouldn't recognize me. For a second, I thought there had to be some mistake, that I'd misread the list. Then Rebecca spoke up. Well, we had to prioritize. She was smiling when she said it, champagne flute in hand, her voice all honey sweet. The kind of tone that made it sound like she wasn't saying something cruel, just stating a fact. I looked at my dad, waiting for him to say something, to realize how this looked. But he barely reacted. He was mid-conversation with someone else, distracted. He gave me a glance like he hadn't even thought about the seating arrangement, like it hadn't crossed his mind that maybe his only daughter shouldn't be sitting in the farthest corner of the reception hall. That was it. That was the moment. Not the seating itself, not Rebecca's smirk, but that glance, the casual indifference, the lack of recognition that anything might be wrong. Because to him, it wasn't wrong. And that's when I knew I was done trying. I smoothed out my navy dress, let out a slow breath, and nodded. Thanks for making it so easy. Then I turned and walked out. I didn't make a scene. I didn't slam doors or yell. I just left, and nobody stopped me. I walked straight to my Honda Civic, my heels clicking against the asphalt parking lot. My hands weren't even shaking. That surprised me because for years I thought this moment would break me. I thought I'd feel devastated, angry, maybe even guilty. Instead, I just felt relief. For once, I didn't have to wonder if I was overreacting or imagining things. Maybe I should just be grateful to be invited at all. It was real. They had shown me exactly where I stood, and for the first time, I believed them. I sat in my car for a few minutes, staring out at the parking lot of the Hilton Garden Inn, half expecting my phone to buzz. Maybe my dad realizing I was gone. Maybe my aunt asking what happened. But it was silent. They were inside drinking Bud Light and celebrating. No one had even noticed. And that's when I laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it was so predictable. I turned on the engine and drove away, past the strip malls and chain restaurants of suburban Phoenix. With every mile that passed, I felt lighter, like I'd been carrying something heavy for years and had finally put it down. The thing is, I'd been preparing for this moment for a long time. Not consciously, but in the back of my mind, I always knew it was coming. My dad and I had been drifting apart for years, even before Rebecca, even before Kyle became the son he actually wanted. It started with my career choice. I was a smart kid, good grades, ambitious. My dad always assumed I'd go into business, law, finance, something that mattered, something that made real money. When I told him I wanted to be a nurse, he didn't yell. He didn't argue. He just sighed like I had told him I was throwing my life away. You're going to work long hours for terrible pay, he said. You'll be exhausted all the time. You're setting yourself up for struggle. I told him I didn't care, that I wanted to help people. His response? You could help people as a doctor or a surgeon. Why would you choose the lowest option? That's how he saw it, like I had chosen something lesser. He never supported me after that. Never asked about my classes at Arizona State, my training, my first job at Banner Health. But when Kyle started his real estate company, Dad invested in him. He talked about him to everyone. Kyle was building something. I was just working. It was always like that. When Kyle needed help, Dad gave it. When I needed help, I got a lecture about figuring things out myself. So I did. I worked through school, took extra shifts at Denny's, covered my own rent in a cramped apartment near campus. And still, whenever my job came up, Dad had something to say. Long shift? Well, you picked it. Still renting? You should have made better choices. Hope you like working nights forever. But here's the worst part, I still showed up for him. When his blood pressure got bad, I was the one checking it. When he was recovering from knee surgery, I was the one making sure he took his medications. When he needed to see a cardiologist, I was the one arranging appointments at Mayo Clinic. Every single time, he brushed it off. It's not like you're a real doctor, or you're making too big a deal out of this. I don't need babysitting. I should have walked away then, but I didn't because I kept thinking, he's still my dad. That has to mean something. But sitting in that parking lot, staring at my silent phone, I realized something. It didn't. I didn't hear from anyone that night. Not a single text. I don't know why I expected one, maybe some last-minute damage control, maybe a half-hearted "where'd you go?" from my dad. A message from Rebecca pretending she was joking. Nothing. I went home to my one-bedroom apartment in Tempe, kicked off my heels, and ordered Chinese takeout from Golden Dragon. I scrolled through Netflix like it was just a normal Saturday night. And I felt fine. Not angry, not sad, just done. But the next morning, the first message came. Aunt Patricia, hey, are you okay? That's how I knew people had started to notice. I ignored it. Then another, Cousin Jake, did something happen? I saw you leave early. Ignored. Then finally, my dad, we need to talk. No apology. No, I'm sorry if you felt left out. Just we need to talk. I left it on read. I spent the next few days waiting for the guilt to hit me. It never did. Instead, I felt lighter. I went to work at Phoenix Children's Hospital, took extra shifts in the NICU, had coffee with my friend Monica from nursing school. I did normal things. And for the first time in years, I wasn't replaying old conversations in my head. No, maybe I should have said this instead. No, maybe I'm being too sensitive. Just silence. It was nice. Then a week later, I got a call from Aunt Patricia. You need to talk to your father. I didn't say anything, just waited. She sighed. He's in the hospital. I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, but because of course he was. He's fine, she added quickly. But he needs help. There was a pause. He wants to see you. Not he feels terrible about what happened. Just he needs help. I should have seen it coming. Turns out my dad had ignored his symptoms for too long. High blood pressure, stress, some kind of complication with his heart medication. Before, I would have been the one catching it early. I would have checked in, reminded him to see his doctor, made sure he was taking care of himself. Now he was stuck in Banner Desert Medical Center, and I wasn't answering his calls. And suddenly, it mattered. The next few days were a family-wide crisis. Rebecca called, I ignored her. Kyle called, ignored him too. Then Aunt Patricia tried again. Look, I get why you're upset. I raised an eyebrow at my phone. Do you? She hesitated. You know how he is. He doesn't mean things the way they sound. I let out a breath. Hey, let's test that. What? Tell me what he meant then. Silence. Because she couldn't. Because he did mean it. Every time, every comment, every time he made me feel small, he meant it. And now he wanted me back. I got another text that night from Dad, I need to talk to you. Not I'm sorry. Not I messed up. Just I need. I turned off my phone and made myself a grilled cheese sandwich. Outside my window, the Arizona sunset painted the sky orange and pink. For the first time in years, I watched it without thinking about anyone else's problems. A week later, Dad was discharged from Banner Desert. The problem? He needed ongoing care. And guess what? That's expensive. Before, he had me. I did it all for free. Checked his blood pressure, monitored his medications, made sure he followed doctor's orders. Now he had to hire someone, and suddenly he couldn't afford it. Rebecca tried one last time, calling while I was grabbing lunch at Chipotle. I think we should put the past behind us. I almost choked on my burrito bowl. Oh, do you? Your dad is struggling. This is a family matter. I let out a short laugh. Right. Family. That's interesting, because a few weeks ago I was sitting at the cousins' table. Silence. So which is it? I asked. Am I family, or am I a distant relative you can ignore until you need something? That's not fair. Neither was your seating chart. I hung up and went back to work. The NICU was busy that day, 3 premature babies requiring round-the-clock monitoring. Real patients who actually needed me, not people who only remembered I existed when it was convenient. I don't know what happened after that call. Maybe they found someone cheaper through a home health agency. Maybe they figured it out on their own with Medicare. All I know is the call stopped, and I hadn't heard from them since. But 3 months later, Rebecca showed up at my job. It was a slow Thursday afternoon at the pediatric clinic. I was finishing up paperwork when I heard a familiar voice at the reception desk. I'm here to see my stepdaughter. It's urgent. I closed my eyes, took a breath. Rebecca. The receptionist, Maria, was already explaining that she needed an appointment, that personal visits weren't allowed during shifts. But Rebecca had that polite but pushy way of speaking that always got her what she wanted, the same tone she'd used at the wedding. I stepped out before she could make a scene. What are you doing here? She smiled like we were old friends meeting for lunch at Paradise Valley Mall. I just wanted to talk. We already did. Over the phone, remember? Her smile twitched. This isn't about me. It's your father. I held up a hand. No, you don't get to bring him up like that's going to change anything. He's not doing well. I let out a short laugh. Yeah, I know. That's what happens when you ignore your health for years. She sighed, glancing around the clinic waiting room where a few patients were watching our conversation with interest. He's getting worse. We can't afford full-time care. And you should have prioritized better. Her eyes flickered. She knew exactly what I meant. This isn't the time for grudges, she tried. He's your father. Silence. Because there was nothing else to say. She wanted me to feel guilty, to suddenly remember my place and step back into my old role like nothing had happened. But I wasn't that person anymore. If he needs care, hire someone, I said. If you can't afford it, ask Kyle. He's the successful one, right? The real estate mogul. Her jaw tightened. He's busy with a new development in Scottsdale. I almost laughed again. Yeah, that's what I thought. I turned to leave, but she grabbed my wrist. You owe him, she hissed, voice low so the other patients couldn't hear. And there was the real reason she was here. I pulled my hand back. No, I don't. Then I walked away, back to my patients who actually mattered. I thought that was the last of it. It wasn't. A week later, my dad called while I was driving home from a 12-hour shift. I almost didn't pick up, but part of me was curious. What could he possibly say now? I answered through my car's Bluetooth. What do you want? Silence for a second, then, hey Natalie. I pulled into the parking lot of a Walgreens and put the car in park. What do you want, Dad? He exhaled. Rebecca said she talked to you. She did. More silence, then, I think we should talk in person. I laughed, actually laughed. Oh, now you want to see me? He ignored that. Come by the house. We'll have dinner. Just us, Rebecca's visiting her sister in Tucson. I glanced at the clock on my dashboard. You know, if you'd asked me that a year ago, I would have been so excited. More silence. But I think we both know this isn't about dinner. He sighed. Just come by, Nat. Please. Against my better judgment, and probably because I was exhausted from my shift, I agreed. The next evening, I drove to the house in Paradise Valley, the one he'd worked so hard to keep after his divorce from my mom. It was weird being back. Nothing had changed. Same beige walls, same leather furniture, same family photos where Kyle appeared in twice as many frames as me. But it didn't feel like home anymore. It hadn't for a long time. Dad was already at the dining table when I walked in. The smell of Panda Express filled the room, orange chicken and fried rice in the familiar white containers. He hadn't cooked. He never did. I sat down across from him. For a few minutes, we ate in silence, the only sound coming from the air conditioning unit struggling against the September heat. Then finally he spoke. "So, how's work?" I almost laughed. "You don't care about my job, Dad." He winced. "That's not true." "Really? Because last time I checked, you thought it was a waste of my potential." He rubbed his temple, a gesture I remembered from childhood when he was stressed about work. "Look, I didn't ask you here to argue." "Then why am I here?" He hesitated, poking at his low mane with a plastic fork. Then finally got to the point. "I need your help." There it was. No pretense, no apology, no acknowledgement of what had happened at the wedding. I put my fork down. "You mean you need free medical care?" "I wouldn't put it like that." "How would you put it?" He shifted in his chair, suddenly looking older than his 62 years. "I just thought since you know all this medical stuff, maybe you could help us save some money on nurses and—" "Why are you making this so hard?" he interrupted. I blinked. "You know what's funny? That's exactly what I used to think. Every time I helped you, every time I looked after you when no one else did, and you still treated me like I wasn't good enough." His expression tightened. "That's not fair, Natalie." "No?" I gestured around the room, at the wedding photos on the side table where Kyle stood next to Dad while I was barely visible in the background. Where was this concern at the wedding? When Rebecca sat me in the back like an afterthought? When you let her? He didn't answer. I shook my head. "You don't want a daughter. You want a free nurse." "That's not true." "Then what is it?" I leaned forward. "What do you actually want from me, Dad?" He opened his mouth, then closed it. Because he didn't have an answer. Or rather, he did, but it wasn't one he could say out loud. That was the last time I saw him. Dad texted a few more times over the following weeks. Short messages, "Can we talk?" and "I'm having some chest pain." I ignored them all. Then the messages stopped. A few months later, I heard through Aunt Patricia that he'd finally hired a home health aide, a certified nursing assistant who charged $30 an hour. And guess what? He could barely afford it. Kyle didn't help, despite closing a $1 million commercial deal in downtown Phoenix. Rebecca complained about the cost but refused to take care of him herself. Meanwhile, I was exactly where I wanted to be. I'd gotten promoted to charge nurse in the NICU, and I was saving money for the first time in years. I'd started dating again, a paramedic named David who actually respected what I did for a living. My life had room for happiness. 1 year later, I got a message from a number I didn't recognize. "Dad's back in the hospital. Thought you should know." I stared at the screen for a long time. Then I blocked the number and didn't look back. 2 years after the wedding, I hadn't thought about my dad in any meaningful way. Not in a maybe I should check in kind of way. Every once in a while, I'd hear something through family. His health wasn't great. He was struggling financially. Rebecca was stressed about money. But none of it was my problem anymore. Actually, I was doing better than fine. Without all the stress, the constant pressure to prove myself, the exhaustion of trying to be accepted by people who didn't care, my life got easier. My job was still demanding, my 12-hour shifts still long. But I liked my life. I had real friends, people who valued me. I traveled to San Diego and Seattle. I started putting money into a 401k for the first time. Meanwhile, my dad had exactly what he'd chosen, a wife who only stuck around because she had nowhere better to go, a son who was too busy with property investments to return his calls, and a mountain of medical bills. I didn't know how bad things had gotten until cousin Jake reached out. "I know you don't want to hear this, but it's bad." I was sitting in my apartment, finally big enough for a real dining table, when the text came through. Jake and I were never that close, but he'd always been one of the few family members who noticed things. I debated ignoring it. Then, against my better judgment, I typed back, "What's bad?" "Your dad. He's completely broke. Had to sell the house." I blinked. That house in Paradise Valley wasn't just some random property. It was the one he'd kept after divorcing my mom, the one he and Rebecca had renovated with granite countertops and a pool. Where is he now? I asked. Some rental apartment in Mesa. He's been asking everyone for money. There was no concern in Jake's message, no urgency, just another attempt to get something out of me. Let me guess, I typed. He told you to reach out? No, Jake admitted. Rebecca did. Of course she did. 2 days later, Rebecca called. I didn't answer. She left a voicemail. I know you're still upset, but we need to talk. I deleted the message without listening to the rest. 3 months later, I ran into Kyle at a Starbucks in Old Town Scottsdale. I was ordering my usual, a vanilla latte, when I heard a familiar voice behind me. Well, look who it is. I turned around. Kyle stood there in an expensive suit, Rolex glinting on his wrist, carrying himself with a kind of confidence that only comes from never having to struggle for anything. He spotted my scrubs. Still doing the whole nurse thing, huh? I exhaled through my nose. Still avoiding Dad's calls? That wiped the grin off his face. What do you want me to do? He said after a moment. He put himself in this position. I tilted my head. He gave you everything. Now you can't even throw him a little help. Kyle scoffed. You didn't help either. Yeah, I said, picking up my latte. Because he treated me like garbage. What's your excuse? Kyle didn't answer because he didn't have one. 6 months later, I found out through Jake that my dad had moved into an assisted living facility. Not one of the nice places like Scottsdale assisted living with gardens and activities, a rundown place in central Phoenix that barely met state health standards but was all he could afford. Kyle really won't help? I asked Jake during one of our rare phone conversations. Nope. Won't even visit. I nodded. That sounded about right. I thought about going once, just to see what he looked like now, if he'd changed. I didn't, because I already knew how it would go. He wouldn't apologize. He wouldn't acknowledge he'd done anything wrong. He would just expect me to fix things, to step back into my old role. And I wasn't doing that. Ever again. A year later, I was sitting in the break room at work when the local news came on. There was Kyle being interviewed in some gleaming high-rise office downtown, talking about his latest development project, luxury condos in Paradise Valley. The banner at the bottom of the screen read, Local developer breaks ground on $50 million project. I stared at the screen. This guy, this millionaire, couldn't spare a dime to help the father who'd given him everything. And my dad had chosen him. He had prioritized him. Now Dad was sitting in a facility that smelled like disinfectant and cafeteria food, struggling alone while Kyle posed for magazine covers, while I had built something real for myself. That's when it hit me. I had won. Not in a petty, vengeful way, but in a deep, meaningful way. I had built a life that was mine, a career I was proud of, relationships that mattered, a future I was excited about. My dad had built his own future too. He'd built it on favoritism and dismissing me, on undervaluing what I brought to the table. And now he was living with the consequences of those choices. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't karma. It was just exactly what he had created. I got one last text from Jake 6 months ago. Dad passed away last night. Just thought you should know. I stared at the message for a long time. I didn't cry. I didn't feel relief either. I just felt nothing. And that told me everything I needed to know about what kind of relationship we'd really had. I typed back, thanks for letting me know. Then I put my phone down and got ready for my shift. Because unlike my dad, I still had people to take care of, people who actually needed me, people whose lives I could make better. And that's exactly where I wanted to be.